Hi, my name is Caleb Hegg. I want to welcome you to this covenant conversation with Chrisdate. Before we get started, I just want to make you aware that we do have a Facebook group called Pronomian Theology where we can discuss and people can ask questions. We can talk about this interview or anything that has to do with pronomian theology. You can also find tons of resources on our website, pronomian.com. And come on over and discuss with us in our Facebook group, Pronomian Theology. All right, without further ado, here is my conversation with Chrisdate. I hope you enjoy. I have the foremost apologist on hell and annihilationism, and I actually don't want to talk about that at all. And I'm sure that we can talk about it a little bit if you want to.
That's fine.
As I looked through your stuff, I realized, I do understand. This is what I'll say about your views on annihilationism. I understand your argument. I get, like, when you debated Al Mohler, I thought that really kind of exemplified for me two sides of the debate, because I did understand what you were saying with the idea of annihilationism being the eternal punishment, because it's forever, right? So I do understand that. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. While at the same time, I think that Al Mohler kind of exemplified a lot of the traditional views of the Christian view of hell. So I don't think I'm going to do any better than Al Mohler did. But with that said, one of the reasons that I'm so interested and so excited to interview you is because we agree on so many things. And as I looked at your website, I went down the list of just like, yes, 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 yes. And then there's a couple of things that we disagree on. And the things that we disagree on are actually kind of the focus of what I'm getting at in what I'm calling covenant conversations. And so some of those things that we're going to look at are like preterists, post-mill versus a-mill and pre-mill perspectives, things like that. So normally I would ask you a couple of questions at the beginning, like, are you post-mill, pre-mill, all that kind of stuff. And I would ask you if you're a dispensationalist or if you're a covenant theologian or other. However, those are really the meat of what I want to talk about in general. So let's just jump right into those and we'll just fill up the entire interview with those questions. So let's start with this. I'm going to let you kind of take over here. When we say preterists, I think most people would know what that means. But for those who don't, explain what you mean by preterist. And then also for me personally, let me know, are you a partial, a full, how preterist are you, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, it sort of does, but I'm going to answer that in a way that perhaps doesn't quite fit the way that you just phrased that question.
Sure.
Historically, preterism just is the belief that most, but not all, biblical prophecies that many people associate with what's awaiting us in our future were actually fulfilled in the distant past, in and around 70 AD when the Roman armies sieged Jerusalem. Historically, preterism, again, just to reiterate, historically, preterism just is the view that most, but not all, such prophecies have already been fulfilled. And that is the view that I hold. So, for example, when we think about things like the mark of the beast or the Great Tribulation, a lot of these things that many, maybe even most American Christians at least think it waits at some point in the future, I think were fulfilled in the distant past. But as a historical preterist, I believe that the resurrection of the dead is still in the future, and that it is indeed a resurrection, unlike some other people that claim the label preterist that we'll talk about in a moment. I believe in the future return of Christ. I believe in the future consummation of all things, and et cetera, and the casting of the wicked into hell, and so forth. So that's what I mean when I say preterist. Most so-called end times biblical prophecies were fulfilled in the past rather than await fulfillment in our future. Now, what has happened is that some 100 years ago or so, a movement began, a very small and still very small, but all throughout its existence, a very vocal but very small community of people who profess the name of Christ and profess the name of preterist. They have sort of been winning the language game. They have, there's a long-standing, people have known this for a long time, that the person who wins the debate around the language will often win the debate. And unfortunately, many people who aren't preterists, maybe they're dispensational premillennialists or what have you, they have unfortunately and unbeknownst to themselves sort of capitulated to that small group of people that is claiming the name preterist. And what that small group of people believes is that all biblical prophecies were fulfilled in the distant past. There await no biblical prophecies yet to be fulfilled in our future. And they have erected a distinction between full and partial preterism, or they'll sometimes say consistent and inconsistent preterism, or whatever. And unfortunately, my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ have sort of capitulated to that language. And so I am what a lot of people would know as a partial preterist. But the reality is that what goes by the name full preterism, it's full of something, but it's not full of preterism. It is better called hyper preterism, because what it does is it takes what may be wrong. I mean, people that aren't preterists can certainly disagree with me. It could be preterism, could be wrong, but it's still very within the pale of orthodoxy. It affirms the resurrection of the dead. It affirms the future return of Christ, and so on and so forth. But hyper preterism takes that belief that most biblical prophecies have been fulfilled, and it takes it to an unjustified extreme that places them outside the pale of orthodoxy. They don't even believe in bodily resurrection, at least not in the historical definition of body and resurrection. And they don't. And there's a lot of other problems too. I recently, maybe a year or so ago, debated a hyperpreterist named Michael Miano, and I got him to admit that hyperpreterism is extremely akin to first and second century Gnosticism. I mean, it's just really terrible. So anyway, in a nutshell, I'm a preterist, what sometimes is known as a partial preterist, because I believe that most, but not all, biblical prophecies have been fulfilled.
Okay, so I just want to hash this out just a little bit. Hang on one second here. So when we talk about some of the prophecies that people might think of, when you say things like the mark of the beast, so now correct me if I'm wrong, but are you seeing that as a numeration for Nero, and are you seeing the Antichrist as Nero in the first century, or are you seeing something else, or do you not go that far? Are you because I know that, like what you're saying, there was a gentleman I just met recently at the Evangelical Theological Society. He believes that Christ came back in 70 and that he's not coming back again. That was it. And
that's a hyper preterist. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So when you see things like in Revelation about, say, the mark of the beast or things like that, are you seeing those already fulfilled, or do you believe those are still to come?
So I believe that everything up until the midway through the 1,000 years that is described in Revelation 20, everything up until that point has indeed been fulfilled, and what awaits fulfillment is what comes after that millennium. In other words, we are, in my belief, right now in the period of time symbolized by that 1,000 years in John's vision. But that means that, yes, the mark of the beast, the number 666, these precede the onset of the millennium, and I do believe that they were fulfilled in the past. The number 666 isn't the mark of the beast. The number 666 is the number of the beast. And in John's day, there was a very widespread practice amongst the Jews called gematria, if I'm pronouncing that right. It wasn't numerology, but it was a way of calculating the number of a person's name by adding up the letters in their name. And what is interesting is that in depending upon how you might spell the name Nero Caesar or Neron Caesar, you will, following the rules of gematria, you will come out to either 666, which is the number that appears in most manuscripts, or 616, which is the number that appears in just a few manuscripts. So yes, I do think that that number is John's way of surreptitiously identifying who the beast is, or at least who the present ruler of the beast is, and I'll clarify that in a moment, so as to avoid being overt and easily detected by the Roman government, because they, of course, wouldn't want to have anything to do with that. Yeah. The reason I said, or possibly the present ruler of the beast, is because John tells us what the beast symbolizes. He tells us in Revelation 17, I think it is, that the 7 heads of the beast are 7 kings, 5 of which have fallen, and the 6th now is. people that are not preterists have to jump through all sorts of contortionist hoops to say that the sixth king now is, but the seventh one is in the distant future. I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, the point is, I don't think the beast is Nero, but I do think that 666 is a reference to Nero in order to identify the beast as the oppressive, persecutorial Roman government. So yes, I do go that far. But again, the 1,000 years, it begins after that, and I think we're in the middle of the period of time symbolized by that, and so there's still some things left to come.
Okay, so you're already answering some of my next questions. Obviously, then you're going to see Christ coming back after that 1,000-year reign, correct? I mean,
I'm reluctant to use the word 1,000-year reign, but
okay.
yes, that's whatever we call that 1,000 years in John's vision. I think that he will return after what that symbolizes. Yeah.
Pardon my choice of words.
That's all right. I try to be really precise on this.
You're right. You're right. Okay. So if that's the case, I saw your debate on actually post-mill versus a-mill. Well, you didn't really talk about a-mill.
I think it was a-mill versus pre-mill, the one with Dan Gepfrick on Unbelievable.
Yeah. So basically, I kind of understand where you're coming from. However, I do have questions. So
sure.
if we're seeing, let's just pretend for a second that I'm understanding you correctly and I'm buying into your view of preterism, which I don't want to admit how close I am to that or not.
Right.
But nonetheless, okay. With that being the case, then what do we do with all the prophecies that we see within the Tanakh? When we look at things like Zechariah, when we look at, 10 chapters almost in Ezekiel talks about a future temple that doesn't seem to have been built yet. And so when we see these things, are we just taking these allegorically? How are you understanding these? It seems like Christ is reigning. And in some instances, it seems like he's reigning and there's still sin on the earth. So how are you reconciling that?
Well, so first of all, I mean, gosh, there's a whole lot to unpack there, and I'll try to get to a few of the salient points. We'd have to go to any specific prophecy in the Tanakh and unpack it for me to be able to answer your question fully. I'm reluctant to assume that prophecies in the Tanakh about a temple are about either a future rebuilt temple or even about a real literal temple at all. So, for example, it seems to me, if I'm not mistaken, that when Ezekiel, halfway through the book we know as Ezekiel, prophesies about a future glorious temple, I don't see any reason to take that prophecy literally. It seems to, or either I don't see any reason to see it as being fulfilled literally, or it could simply be a reference to the second temple, since this was written in the time after the destruction of the first temple and before the second temple that was there when Christ came, before it was rebuilt. So I think either of those approaches are possible. And to the metaphorical idea, or I think a more precise way to put it would be symbolic. I think that these prophecies are symbolic. I mean, we have statements in the New Testament where we are called God's temple, the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so I think it's very possible that some of those Old Testament prophecies made to Israel are fulfilled in some way, shape, or form, metaphorically, spiritually, what have you. But I don't think that's the case with all of them. And I think that it strikes me that there are a lot of prophecies that I think could very well be fulfilled in the eschaton, the time after the 1,000 years. I don't see any reason to think that Christ and his people have to reign literally for 1,000 years in order to fulfill those Old Testament prophecies. They could reign literally in the new heavens and new earth after the 1,000 years are over, and that could fill a lot of those prophecies. So I think there's a lot of plausible ways, at least by my estimation, for understanding those things. For me, though, the reason why I'm willing to admit a certain degree of uncertainty as to what how those would be fulfilled in my model is because I'm basing my model on the clear rather than the unclear. So, for example, when John both opens and closes his book with two or more different ways of saying that the bulk of his prophecy is about to be fulfilled, like right around the corner, He's not using code language. It's not part of his prophecy. This is prior to the onset of his vision and after its close that he makes these statements about its near fulfillment. And as much as non-preterists like to try to jump through hoops to try to explain how that language is more language of imminence rather than immediacy, there's just no getting around it. When he says that God showed me the things that will soon take place, there's no getting around that. And I see similar things going on, for example, in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Jesus uses a whole lot of cosmic prophetic language that we see all throughout the Tanakh that is not intended to be taken literally. Things like God coming on clouds, lightning flashing from east to west, a lot of this sort of cosmic, prophetic, apocalyptic language. And there's a lot of room, therefore, for understanding how it is that that's meant to be fulfilled. But he's answering the question that his disciples asked him, which is, look at these buildings right here, Jesus. When it's in that context that they ask, what will be the sign of your coming? And his answer is, these buildings right here will be torn down, and not one stone will be left upon another. And it's in that context that he says, this generation, this Genea, will not pass until all these things take place. And there is no legitimate way to turn that word into the word genos, which means race or kind, or to say that generation means something other than generation. No, very clearly, Jesus is saying, these are things that are going to happen within the lifetime of his contemporaries. And the fact that the siege upon Jerusalem happened in a way that was so consistent with his prophecy is actually a real boost to his authority. We don't have to tremble when we're challenged by skeptics who say Jesus was a false prophet. No, he was right. It happened within the lifetime of his contemporaries. But the problem is that when we treat the prophetic, cosmic, apocalyptic language as the lens through which we should read the plain, straightforward, ordinary language, then we're going to start having to jump through hoops and doing gymnastics and end up with inconsistencies. I would rather let the clear be the lens through which I struggle to understand the unclear, and I think that non-preterists do it the other way around.
Okay, so I don't want you to feel like I'm attacking you here, but
Sure.
Instead of going into Ezekiel, because obviously we're not going to sit here and read 10 chapters of Ezekiel and try to work our way through that. Let's just look at Zechariah 14. I'm going to start in 16. And I mean, we can even just paraphrase this, right? Basically, at this point, all the nations come up to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and keep the festival of booths. So they are going up to Jerusalem. It seems to me, and you can certainly disagree with this, obviously, but it seems to me like this is temple language, that they're going up to celebrate the festival. They're going up to celebrate the festival of booths. Festival of booths certainly incorporates sacrifices, and they're going to Jerusalem. And it seems to me like all these different nations are going up, but Egypt might refuse. So this even, to me, looks like the opportunity of unrighteousness by Egypt. So to me, that would say that we're not in a time when everything has been made perfect, right? I mean, so how are you seeing this? Let me just ask that. How are you interpreting this?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think that there are at least a couple of ways of going about it. One of them is to think that what this is actually a reference to is a prophetic reference to the spread of the church throughout all nations, the spread of God's kingdom that we see slowly, not so slowly, expanding throughout the book of Acts, and now is encompassing people from every tribe and every nation and people and tongue on the planet. I think that that's what this could be prophetically referring to, using the reality Israel was familiar with as a metaphor for the all of the people of God throughout the world coming to faith. But I also think it's possible that, this actually could refer to the eschaton. It doesn't say that any of the families of the earth won't go up to Jerusalem to worship the king. It says, if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem, if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves. So I don't, and if everybody does, including Egypt and all the other nations of the earth in the eschaton, then I don't see how that's at all inconsistent with this passage. So again, for me, it's like I'm dealing with what is by its very nature difficult language, a different kind of language to understand with confidence, as compared to language that is just plain and straightforward before any prophetic, like a prophetic cosmic apocalyptic language is used. God, these are the things that God showed me that will soon take place. That is not a part of his vision. It's not a part of his prophecy. He's just telling his audience, you know what I mean? Unlike what we're seeing here. So again, I try to accept some degree of uncertainty with the less clear language like this in favor of what I take to be the clearer language.
It's interesting because I take Zechariah 14 to be literal, and I do see it to be in the future. However, I have taught many times before that Sukkot is actually a looking forward to eternity. And so, honestly, that could fit into the teachings that I've done before, could fit into a metaphorical understanding that you're presenting. Not that I agree with that. I'm just saying that
Sure.
I do see how I see how you're approaching it. So
and let me just add that just because Sukkot, if it entails sacrifices in the Old Covenant, does not mean that the only way at any point in the future God could ordain for this festival to be celebrated properly is with animal sacrifices. I mean, we are both, to one degree or another, very sympathetic to the Messianic movement. You probably a little more so than I, but I feel very sympathetic to it. And I don't feel like there is any lack in my celebration of Pesach when I do so in a Messianic context where there is no need for any more animal sacrifices because the one perfect sacrifice that all of those sacrifices pointed forward to has now come. So I think it's possible that, the church may literally celebrate the Feast of Booths in eternity future, but without the animal sacrifices, since the ultimate sacrifice has already been made.
That could actually take us into some really interesting territory, and territory that I was not expecting to go. But I'll go there just real quickly anyway. You've actually touched on several things that I really want to get to. Ultimately, your view of the church versus Israel. But for now, so I agree with you that Christ's death on the cross fulfilled all sacrifices that pointed to him. However, I personally don't think it would be an offense to the cross to have the picture of sacrifice point back to the cross. Now, I know that is a very not accepted view in Christianity at all. But when we look at things like Acts 21:22, when Paul goes, we're talking 20 to 25 years after he accepts Christ. He goes to the temple and it says that he sacrifices. Do you think that is a problem for our view of Christ fulfilling the sacrificial system?
Yes and no, but probably not. When I say yes, it's probably not in the way that you think. Although it does strike me that there is sort of a visceral reaction that I have to the idea of post-Christ sacrifices, and I'll admit that. But that isn't why I don't find that to be a plausible view of the eschaton. And to be fair, I think you, if you're a premillennialist, would say I'm not talking about the eschaton. I'm talking about sacrifices during the millennium, and that's fair. But for somebody like me who does think that it's possible that these things will be celebrated in the eschaton, the reason why I would push back against sacrifices has to do with the fact that I don't think there will be death anymore. I see the eschaton as a time where death has been destroyed, not just for humankind, but for all of God's soulish, his nefesh chaya. And so that would be my pushback. And obviously, in your case, if you're a premillennialist, that wouldn't apply because death hasn't been destroyed. Well, I'm going to go there now a little bit. So if you watch that debate, you'll know that I made the case, whether it's compelling or not is, of course, another question. But in that debate, I made the case that, look, Paul is saying that death will be destroyed when the saints are raised immortal. And of course, a premillennialist believes that the saints are raised immortal at the beginning of the millennium. So I think that a premillennialist would have to say that either death has been destroyed only for some people at the beginning of the millennium, and then it's fully destroyed at the end, or they would have to say it's only about people and it's not about animal life. I don't know. I'll leave that to them. But for me, it seems what I think I see in 1 Corinthians 15 and elsewhere is that the immortalization of the resurrected saints is coterminal. It's contemporaneous with the defeat of death, and I think that includes all of God's nefesh chaya, not just humankind.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be completely honest with you. You've kind of found the Achilles heel to my pre-mill belief, which is that I don't understand, even in my own, I have not figured out for myself how the resurrection of the dead would happen and there be no death anymore. Because I think that within the millennial reign, to me, it seems as though there is death still. And so this is really kind of one of those places where I'm willing to say I honestly have not figured this one out yet. So I mean, you're pushing on a pressure point that certainly is a pressure point. It's one that I'm uncomfortable with myself.
Well, this is exactly how brothers, I think, should work these kinds of things out, is just talking about it as brothers. So often this debate and many others, as I think you're familiar with as well, turn into shouting matches and calling each other heretics and stuff like that. Why can't we just accept, look, you haven't got all of your ducks in a row, I certainly don't have all my ducks in a row, but we both have our respective reasons for letting certain factors be the lens through which we see the rest, and we just got to hash those things out, even if we don't end up agreeing.
And you know what? I've been called the heresy hunter before, and I am trying to turn over a new leaf. So let's keep going, and I'll try not to call you a heretic.
Okay.
Now I want to shift gears. I guess it's not completely. We've talked a lot about, the eschaton and things like that. And ultimately, here's the thing, is that I watched your debate with, he has two first names, Steve Gregg, right? Okay, so... and I tend to follow, I don't know if it's Mr. or Dr., sorry, Mr. Gregg's line of reasoning more than I do yours. But I'm at the same time, you said some things where I'm kind of cocking my head going, I think we might actually kind of be saying the same things in some places. So you talk about this remnant of Israel, and maybe here's maybe the easiest way to go about this. I'll just show you my hand, and then you can comment on how you agree or disagree. Because to be honest with you, I'm not sure if even though I watched that debate, I'm not sure I fully understand your argument here.
Okay.
The way that I see this whole thing playing out is that Israel is God's covenant people. And as God gives his covenant to the covenant people, some of them reject the covenant, okay? And you have this remnant who, and when I say reject the covenant, what I mean is they don't just reject the land covenant, when they come to the land and say, no, we don't want it. They actually reject the covenant in total, which would be all of the covenants put together, which I see as faith in a coming Christ to deal with sin. Okay. So Abraham looked for it. He believed, it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay. So and Paul uses him as the model of faith in Galatians. Okay. So I see that remnant as being saved through the blood of Christ, even if it's the blood of Christ that's going to be shed to come. Okay. So that's how I see the remnant. Once the quote unquote church comes in, they are added to the remnant, whether Jew or Gentile. And that expands what I would consider to be Israel, true Israel, which I would see as covenant members. So it seemed in your debate with Steve Gregg, you're making what it seemed to me was that you're agreeing that the covenant people, or that remnant, is the people who are saved. But it also looked to me like you were trying to say that Jew and Israel were the same word within Romans, at least. Now, I probably got it all wrong, so set me straight on this.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're fairly close. I do think that I do not believe that the word Israel ever refers to God's covenant people in a sense that could include Gentiles. I don't see any evidence for that. In other words, I don't think it's basically a synonym for church. And the only place I see in the New Testament where the word Israel or the word Jew might have a nuanced meaning is in Romans. One of those two words, the word Jew, is used in a bit of a nuanced way in the early portion of Romans, where it says a Jew is not a Jew who is one outwardly, it's one who is one inwardly. And then the word Israel is a meaning is nuanced in Romans 9 through 11, where Paul seems to talk about, he says it's not the people, the descendants of Abraham who are the people of Israel. It's the I've forgotten it, but it's a people.
Not all who are descended from Abraham are
right.
Israel.
It's the children of the promise, right?
Right.
So and here's what I think. I think what he's saying is that there's an Israel within Israel, or there's a subset of Jews who are truly Jews. So the Jew in the early portions of Romans, who is a Jew inwardly, in my view, isn't a Gentile. And I don't even think there's an argument to be made there. It's just an assumption on the part of people that think otherwise. Because all that we know is that he seems to be saying that at least some subset of Jews are true Jews. What he doesn't make any argument for is that subset, it's not just a subset, it's also people outside of the ethnic designation Jew who are truly Jews. There's just no evidence of that. And similarly with Israel in Romans 9 through 11. So my position is that Israel is an ethnic identity. It is the people it is the biological descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I think that within Israel, there is a remnant, a believing remnant that really truly represents what Israel is meant to be, and therefore is most deserving of the word Israel, of the name Israel. And I think that remnant of Israel is part of the church. And so I think in my debate, I used a sort of overlapping circles diagram, and I said here's the Jews, over here's the church, and where they overlap is the remnant. And that's my view. So when Paul talks about, for example, the Israel of God, I don't think he's talking about the church. I think he's talking about the remnant. But here's the thing: the remnant and the church, the remnant and the rest of the church, the Gentiles, believers, have become one people. Absolutely. I just don't think that makes them all Israel. Anyway, does that help at all to understand what I'm saying?
Sure, but just to push on that a little bit, you would admit, and I think agree, that a person, no matter what their race, who comes into covenant relationship with God is therefore a covenant member, right? I mean, and that's ultimately what Israel is, because those who are, and actually this could get into our another place that I want to go, which is into Romans 11 just a little bit. But I actually got a lot to go here. But so talking about covenant membership, I mean, it seems to me that I gotta slow down here because my brain is going a million miles a second. But
it's all right.
It seems to me that what we're talking about really is covenant membership, right? And so my question, I guess, would be, if a person attaches, obviously in the Torah, and you admit this in your debate with Greg. In the Torah, if a person attaches themselves to the covenant of Israel, they become a covenant member and are just assimilated into Israel, right? This is how you explain in your debate that this is how the mixed multitude is considered Israel, right?
Sure, that's right. They enter into the Mosaic covenant by undergoing the requirements of the Mosaic covenant, which is circumcision and so on and so forth. And yes, that makes them part of Israel, but I don't think it follows from that therefore every participant in the new covenant is likewise Israel. I don't see any evidence of that.
Okay, hang on. So two things there. First of all, circumcision is part of the Abrahamic covenant first and foremost, right? I mean, you said it was Mosaic, but it's actually Abrahamic. And so ultimately, and I know I'm nitpicking on that, but I actually think that's a important distinction, because this is, I think, Paul's point throughout the New Testament, the Apostolic Scriptures, is that he's saying, no, the Gentiles are included in this covenant, the Abrahamic covenant.
The new covenant.
And the Abrahamic covenant, though, right?
Well, I'm not convinced that the church is participants in the Abrahamic covenant. The covenant was That's interesting. That's an interesting way to think about it. So if we were to look at Romans, I think it's 4, maybe 5, where Paul talks about Abraham and we're children of the faith, I'm not sure that that it can be extrapolated from that the church is participating in the Abrahamic covenant. Part of the Abrahamic covenant was that to Abraham and his descendants, that promise was in you, the world would be blessed. But that seems to imply that there's a distinction between Abraham and his descendants and the ones who would be blessed in them.
Sure.
So I think I've just sort of always understood, rightly or wrongly, that the church, the Gentile parts of the church, at the very least, the Gentiles in the church, are those people who have been blessed by through Abraham's descendants, just like the promise seems to have been made to Abraham. I've never taken that to mean that therefore we are participants in the Abrahamic covenant, but that's something I should probably think about and consider.
So I'm going to move and just pretty much steal Walter Kaiser's line of thinking in this, but I asked Walter Kaiser a question on the New Covenant one time, and he said, this is going to surprise you to hear, which it did not surprise me at all to hear, but he said, it's going to surprise you to hear that the New Covenant was not made with the church, it was made with Israel. And this
that's for sure. Absolutely.
So where are you seeing the inclusion of the, and you say church, and I know what you mean by that, but when we talk about church within the New Testament, really it's just the word ecclesia, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The congregation.
Right. So how do you see the inclusions of the Gentile? How do you see the inclusion of the Gentiles into the new covenant? Because even when Christ says, "This is the new covenant in my blood," he's talking to Jews, right? I mean, his disciples were Jews, right?
Yes, but we have Paul writing to various congregations and talking about being participants in that covenant and participants in that in that, what's the word I'm looking for? Ordinance, right? So if Paul gives every indication that he expects both Jews and Gentiles to participate in the Lord's Supper, then that would be an indication that Gentile Christians are participants in that covenant as well.
I agree with you. I agree with you that Gentiles are participants in that as well. But I'm seeing this as covenant inclusion. In other words, and this goes back to your statement about Israel, Gentiles never being identified as Israel. I would say that the new covenant being for Israel means that the Gentiles therefore have some share in Israel, heirs according to promise.
Well, so I want to be careful to say when in the Tanakh, God promises that he's going to make a new covenant with the house of Jacob, with the people of Israel. I don't see any indication there, at least off the top of my very fallible memory, that what he is saying is that this is I will make this with you and only you. And therefore, anybody that participates in that covenant will therefore also be part of the you that I'm calling Israel or the house of Jacob. It seems to me at least plausible that he could be saying, I'll make that covenant with you. But then for other for the Goyim to be participants in that covenant as well would not make that promise have been to be false, right? It would still be a covenant made with the people of Israel, the remnant of Israel. It's just that it would also be made with the rest of the church. That's kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah, I actually think that that's the case with all the covenants, actually. So anyway, let's move to Acts 7:38. As we said, the word church that translates ecclesia. And in this passage, Israel is actually called the ecclesia. So if we want to translate it accordingly.
Yeah, but I mean, come on. I mean, it's just like the word church can have different reference, right? There's the church, but there's also the local church, right? In the same way, we figure out what the meaning of ecclesia is in any given context by looking at what is the context. And here it's the congregation in the wilderness. So I'm not sure that we can, I think it would be exegetically careless to say, because Israel is called the ecclesia here, therefore anywhere the word ecclesia is used, it could refer to Israel and not something distinct from Israel.
I completely agree with you. I guess what
Okay.
I'm trying to highlight is that just as we can't take the word ecclesia to we can't put it in a box. I think that actually Israel has multiple meanings, and Steve Gregg brings this out, right? He shows multiple meanings. Now you pushed back on some of them, and I possibly rightly so, right? I'm just trying to highlight that it seems as though the words have a more fluid sense. And actually, when we get into Romans 11, and this is really where I want to go here, is into Romans 11, because I'm a little bit confused on exactly what it is you believe the root is, and the olive tree is. Can you just explain your understanding of Romans 11 and what is the root there in the olive tree?
I think that the root is either Christ or it represents all people that are in union, in covenant with God or whatever. Meaning, I don't assume that the root is Israel and that the Gentile believers have been grafted into Israel. And I'm familiar with at least some of the arguments. It's a little bit more than just an assumption that that's what's going on, that they're being grafted into Israel. It's a little bit more than an assumption because there's an argument about the bush, the tree being so frequently a metaphor, a reference to Israel all throughout the Old Testament, and even parts of the New. So I think that there's definitely an argument to be made there, but I don't see it as a compelling one. I don't see Paul here calling that root into which the Gentiles are grafted as being Israel. That seems to be a conclusion that's drawn, not something that is clear in the text itself. So I think what Gentiles are grafted into is relationship with God or covenantal union with God or whatever, such that people, that body. I mean, Paul elsewhere says, for example, that he tore the dividing wall down, making the two people one. The imagery there doesn't sound like, to me anyway, he takes the dividing wall down and then all the people over here just come over here. Rather, it sounds like the dividing wall is taken down and the two people become one. And in a similar way, I think what's going on here is that you've got a bush that after the unbelieving Jews are extracted from that bush, has Gentile believers grafted into it. And so the bush now includes believing Israel, but also believing Goyim. And I don't think that makes, unless it can be demonstrated conclusively in my mind, that the bush itself is supposed to be a reference to Israel, or that the root is, or something like that. I'm not inclined to think that that's what's going on here, that that's the picture being painted.
So the idea that the bush or the root is Christ, the problem that I have with this is that there are people who are called natural branches. In other words, it seems to me that would mean born into it. As a Calvinist, and I know you're a 6-point Calvinist. I'm only a 5-point Calvinist. But as a 6-point Calvinist, are those people who are born in but can be taken off? Obviously, this can't mean Christ, because if it means Christ, does it mean salvation?
Well, the notice I threw that out there as a possibility, but
Sure.
that wasn't actually what I leaned on in my explanation of what I actually hold. So I think that God is faithful. The people of Israel, even the unbelieving ones, experienced a great deal of God's blessing by virtue of being born into that covenant. And yes, they also were subject to the curses and punishments of the covenant, but nevertheless, merely by being a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I think that they were participants in the blessings of that covenant. And so likewise, and so I don't see unbelieving Israel being broken out, those branches being broken off as necessitating that the root be, say, either the Mosaic covenant or Abraham or Isaac or something like that. Again, I think that root represents, and a bush represents, all who are in relationship with God, and Gentiles are grafted into that.
So I actually agree with you completely. I see the root as being the Abrahamic covenant, and I see the branches as being covenant membership, which I think Paul tends to see as believing Israel. And this is his point about them being able to be broken off, is that they can be taken out of covenant membership. Now, obviously, this brings a slew of problems in and of itself, because Does that mean that they had, were they saved in that covenant membership? The answer is no, obviously, because Paul rails against the notion that bloodline saves you. So, okay.
Well, really quick, I want to say one last thing though.
Sure.
I am totally happy to admit that they're still thinking through this that I need to do. What strikes me though is that if it were the case that Gentiles grafted into whatever this bush represents were therefore properly called Jews, and if it were the case that the church, I'm using the English word church, not the Greek word ecclesia, but the global church is deserving of the moniker Israel, it strikes me as a deafening silence that there is no clear place anywhere in the scriptures where those words are used in that way. In fact, I think the strongest argument that Steve Gregg had during the debate was that there's so much imagery that is applied to Israel then and the church now, so many descriptions and things. And I didn't think of it at the time during the debate, but it occurred to me not long after. I could talk at great length about the commander-in-chief and the podium where the State of the Union address is given, the person who flies on Air Force One, and so on and so forth. I could use all of these descriptions, and if you go back 40 years, you'll find that all of those descriptions consistently described Joe Biden, right? Of course not. The point being that just because there's all these things that are characteristic or descriptive of an office are used from one person who holds the office then and another person who holds the office now does not mean that they're the same person, that they have the same name. Well, and so analogously, what I'm arguing is that just because the church is described in all of these different ways that in previous times would have been reserved for the people of Israel doesn't mean that they deserve the name Israel. I take Israel to be a name, not a title of an office or something like that. And so for me, it seems like the strongest evidence that Steve Gregg doesn't even get him what he wants anyway. And meanwhile, what I see in the New Testament and in the Old, for that matter, is a deafening silence in terms of where the words Jew and Israel are used of any Gentile that has not come into the Mosaic covenant or through circumcision, and by the way, it's not like they could be grafted into the Abrahamic covenant and ignore the Mosaic one. In order to become a part of the people of Israel, they had to become a part of the Mosaic covenant too, not just the Abrahamic one. So anyway, I'm starting to ramble here, but I wanted to get those out there before we moved on.
You're good. And actually that's brought up a couple of different things. So I guess one of the questions that I should ask you is, first, let me precursor this. I think that the word Jew is different than Israel, and I think this is actually one of the distinctions that Paul starts to make in his letters is this notion that if you're Jewish, you're in, like you're a covenant member because you have blood, and I think that Paul is actually saying no, wait, this is not necessarily the case, and so Jew I think is predominantly a bloodline distinction, whereas Israel sometimes, and once again, now we're talking about words having various meanings, but I think that sometimes Israel can refer to a nation, but I think it can also refer to the remnant, and I think that remnant is not necessarily a bloodline. I think it's anyone who is in covenant relation. So that brings me to this question: do you believe in a spiritual Israel? Would that be a fair? You say no, so go ahead and explain what you would mean by that. Just no.
I wouldn't even use. In fact, I have to refrain from visibly rolling my eyes anytime I hear somebody use either the phrase spiritual Israel or the phrase ethnic Israel. Now, I understand there is a distinction between the people of Israel and the modern nation state of Israel. And so when people use ethnic Israel to distinguish between those two, I'm fine. But typically when I hear people use the phrase ethnic or biological Israel or something like that, what they mean is as contrasted with spiritual Israel. And that's not language I'm willing to embrace. What I will say, though, is that again, I've said that I think there's a sense in which the believing remnant of Israel are the truest examples of what it means to be Israel, what Israel was intended to be, and as such, I do think if I were to embrace the use of a phrase like spiritual Israel, I would think it probably refers to the believing remnant of Israel, not the whole church.
So, I mean, I agree with you on this. I wrote a blog post titled "There's No Such Thing as Spiritual Israel," and the reason why is, once again, I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but ultimately I come back to the notion that one of the uses of the term Israel is covenant inclusion, and that is not by bloodline. It's by faith in Christ. And so I see this as, when ultimately, I personally would be able to say, yes, I believe in what my father has termed enlargement theology, that as covenant members come into the body of Christ, they enlarge that remnant of Israel, and therefore they are enlarging Israel, hence enlargement theology. So it's a huge topic, and maybe we just worked out all the problems to it, right? Maybe that's what we just
I
did.
seriously doubt that, and I don't think that I'm. Yeah, like I said, this is an issue about which I think I still have a lot of thinking to do. Yeah, again, for me, it just comes down to. So there are a couple of issues here from my perspective that motivate me to. Let me be clear here. That make me want to try to preserve, if it's biblically possible, the distinction between Christ followers and Israel. And those motivating factors are, number one, it seems to me that from very early on, 100 AD, roughly, something like that, the church has really terribly mistreated the Jewish people. That's one factor. Another factor is that it seems to me that Gentile Christians, many of them, and this kind of goes hand in hand with that first thing I said, their view that the church is somehow spiritual Israel becomes something of an excuse for being dismissive of Jewish people, for adopting any promise that is made in the Old Testament and applying that to the church, including its huge majority of Gentiles. And how funny it is, by the way, that they don't ever seem to want to embrace the curses in those covenants. They only ever seem to want to apply the blessings. So I guess what I'm saying is I admit that I have some motivations to try and find a way to uphold what I think the biblical distinction is. But I do think that if it could be shown to me pretty clearly that there is a sense in which the church deserves that designation, I will embrace it. I just haven't seen it yet.
So I know we're coming to the end of the time here, at least.
I'm not in a hurry.
I'm coming to the end of my time, perhaps. But at the same time, I do have several questions. And perhaps at the forefront of my mind is, obviously Israel is called God's chosen people. So if there is the church, which is separate from Israel, then does God have two people, two chosen people?
So I would not use the word separate. I would say distinct.
So he has two distinct people.
Yeah, well, no, I would say he has one people that includes two distinct ethnic designations, Jew and non-Jew. So, for example, when Paul says that there is neither Jew nor Gentile in Christ, there's neither male nor female, there's neither slave nor free, he is saying that those distinct subgroups are fully united as one group. That doesn't mean that the distinctions are gone. It just means that the distinctions are just that. They're just distinctions. It doesn't mean that one or the other is any more important or is a different people of God from the other or anything like that. I agree. You might as well say, does that mean if there are males and females, does that mean there are two peoples of God? No, there's one people of God that has males and females in it. Similarly, I think there's one people of God that has both Jews and Gentiles.
But it seems like what you've said is that there is the church and then there is Israel. Or maybe we should say this. Maybe I should rephrase this completely. Is the remnant of Israel separate from the church?
No, I don't. No, I don't think so. This is why I use that diagram of overlapping circles, right? The
So you're
remnant is
just
where the
calling that
two
the
circles.
church.
Huh?
You're just calling that part that overlapped. You're just calling that the church, right?
No. Sorry. Here's the church. This circle.
Hmm.
This circle is Israel. Where they overlap is the remnant. So the remnant is that segment of the Jews of Israel that are also part of the church. That's the way I see it. So if this is the church, there's a sliver of it that is also that is the believing remnant of Israel, and then the rest of the church is Gentile. So
So
yes, I do think the remnant is part of the church.
okay, so the remnant is part of the church. Then why the distinction? Is Paul just and this is a genuine question. I'm not trying to get a I got you here. The genuine question in terms of how you're seeing this. So then is Paul just distinguishing that remnant of Jews to show the inclusion of Israel into the church, or is it vice versa that the remnant? I mean, it seems that there's obviously this distinction that Paul's making. Why is he making that?
Well, I think he's making it because the distinction began to exist when God called Abraham out of Ur, right? I mean, I don't think that Paul needs a reason to continue to propagate a distinction that has existed for thousands of years prior to him. But that having been said, why does the distinction? What distinct role does that distinction make in Paul's thinking? And yeah, it does seem to me as if at the beginning of Romans 9-11, Paul is using the concept of remnant to say the remnant is included in the church, because what he's doing is he's answering the question, look, if all of this was prophesied by the Jewish scriptures, then why do so many of the Jewish people, why do they reject their Messiah? And Paul's answer is, well, actually not all of them have.
Sure.
So yeah, I do think that the point of the remnant distinction is not to say Gentiles are part of that, but rather to say that Gentiles or the believing remnant is part of this people of God that resulted from the barrier, the wall being torn down.
Interesting. Well, Chris, as always, it's fun to pick your brain, and I hope to do it again soon. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
Yeah, I hope we got to everything you wanted to, and hopefully viewers can tell or listeners, depending on how they're consuming this, that this is these are challenging issues, and we're going to, frankly, I think we're going to continue to be debating them until Christ returns. And by the way, I don't know that the debate will finish at that point. When Jesus arrived on the scene, he didn't go around answering all the questions he was asked.
That's
and
right.
so I think it's very possible that in the eschaton, we will still continue to do theology and even disagree with each other, but in a way that is utterly without sin. I think it's a beautiful thing when brothers and sisters in Christ can get together like you and I have done and press each other a bit, challenge each other a bit, but at the same time acknowledge I don't have all the answers and here might be some of my weak points. And so thank you for inviting me to have that opportunity. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I hope we do it again soon. It's Chrisdate. And by the way, just so you know, you can find more of Chris's work, his interviews, his debates, his blog posts, his articles that he's written. You can find it all at Chrisdate.info. And yeah, you can find it all there. That's where I found a ton of stuff and some really good debates to watch and to listen to. Thank you so much, Chris. And I will see everyone next time.